Hello and welcome to another instalment of Pole Position on History Hack. Alina, who have you brought forth today?
Today we have a good friend of mine who's coming to talk to us about the tango in Poland. Juliette Bretan is a freelance journalist and a researcher into Polish interwar music. You can find her articles on culture.pl, Notes from Poland, and various other online magazines. So hi, Juliette.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, whereabouts are you and how is lockdown?
So I'm in Lincolnshire, so Eastern England, so quite rural. And I'm liking being rural because I feel like it's safer. And it's just, I was living in London before this and I just decided to come back here, back to my family home because I thought, it's so much safer out of the city. But yeah, it's okay. It's kind of the boredom setting in, I think now. And it's that feeling of not being able to go anywhere. Or you get an hour's exercise a day and that's it. And I'm sure you know what it's like. It's a strange time. Feels a bit dystopian.
Yeah, we just said when everybody finally has to go back and fill their days again, I think we're all going to collapse under the weight of everything we're expected to do. We've got so used to doing nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm just like, all the days are merging into one at the moment. You sort of wake up and then the next thing you know, it's evening again. I don't know what day are we actually on? Is it Monday? I don't know anymore.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. It's good to keep busy, though. I think when all this is going on, you have to have that distraction, don't you?
Exactly. But listen, we are here to talk about the tango. But
we are indeed.
Is this some of your code words for World War II, or have you actually gone away from World War II?
Do you know what? We have gone away from World War II, and it's actually amazing, isn't it? Because Juliette, what you don't know is Alex gave me an earful over the weekend, or actually more last week. And she goes, "Look, Alina, all we're doing at the moment is World War II. You need to get out of the World War II bubble." So I said, fine, we will find something else. So now we're actually going into the 1920s, but we're not talking about tango the drink, but we're talking about tangos and the dance and the music. So can you tell us a little bit more about the music of tango?
Yeah, absolutely. Tango is this beautiful dance. It's very sensuous, sexy, kind of rich dance, but it also veers into that sort of dark and dangerous territory as well. So it came from Argentina, from the sort of lower classes and a very urban background as well. But then in the 20s and the 30s, this is tango's golden age. And this is where it turns from being kind of lower class dance to something more glamorous and more sort of sophisticated. But all of these songs still have that underlying violence and threat and danger to them. So it's really kind of intoxicating sound.
Excellent. So how does it come to Poland and when?
So this all fits in with tango's golden age in the kind of 20s and 30s. So it comes to Poland, first of all, in around about 1912. But then it never really takes on because obviously you've got the First World War, you've got Poland fighting to regain independence. But then when Poland does regain independence, that's when this kind of really takes hold. And in the 1920s, you kind of, obviously, we all know about the Great Gatsby, this sort of decadence, people partying, that kind of thing. And that's when it begins to really take hold in Poland as well, because there were so many talented musicians who were working at the time. And a lot of them have classical backgrounds, and a lot of them are Jewish, so they've got Jewish musical backgrounds as well. But they come together and they listen to this new sound coming from America mainly, like foxtrots and tangos as well. And they write their own music, and it becomes this, it really, really sticks in Poland. People just don't know about it, because when you say tango, you think about, Argentina, you think about the kind of South American sort of countries. You don't really think about it taking hold in Poland, but it does, because it's this romanticized kind of sentimental genre, and it plays into those sentimental trends that were in music at the time. So as I was saying, it really takes hold in the 20s. 1929 is the big year for tango. This is when the big hit happens. It's called Tango Milonga. And this was written in 1929. It gets translated into English and basically is sung all across the world as O Donna Clara. So it's still a very popular hit today. But then there were so many hits. There were thousands and thousands of these songs. And as the period moved in the 20s into the 30s, tango becomes really different to how it was in Argentina. So it becomes more kind of melancholic, more vulnerable. The melody is a bit slower. You have these anguished sounds of violins and later on Hawaiian guitar, which pervade the music as well. And the singers, you have, these singers singing about heartbreak and devastation, and it turns into almost a kind of lamenting sound. So very, very different to the original, but it's still this really, really breathtaking music, and I'm completely in love with it. I've never heard anything like it before.
You can always check out Juliette's Twitter, because she's always posting something about the tango or a song or something from YouTube. So if you're on it, we'll plug your account in a moment. But the tango was obviously popular, right? We've established that. How did it actually influence day-to-day life in Poland during the 20s and 30s?
So tango quickly becomes like the most popular genre. And it's all tied into how the 20s is this kind of spending culture, consumerist culture. People are wanting to buy and spend money, and also they're wanting to be a bit more sexy, a bit more daring. So that's why it kind of plugs into that trend as well. But it influences day-to-day life in various ways. So not just simply people wanting to spend money on records, people wanting to, flock to the cabarets, but also the musicians as well behind this music. So as I mentioned before, there were loads of Jewish musicians who maybe they face discrimination in other areas of life, but particularly in somewhere like cabaret, where you're sort of upending hierarchies and making fun of traditions. That's where Jewish musicians could really, they could have fun, and they could play these songs and write these most beautiful pieces. So it's sort of on a social level, it has an impact. On a kind of consumerist level, it has an impact as well. So yeah, it's sort of pervading the whole of cultural output in the era, really.
Jerzy Peter Spersky, who was he, and what influence does he have on the Polish tango?
So he's probably the most popular or most well-known proponent of tango, and he was the one who wrote that very famous hit in 29, Tango Milonga. But he also wrote thousands of other tangos as well, and he was a classical musician trained in classical music. But as this period moved into the 1920s, he realised that popular music was obviously going to be more lucrative. So he starts writing popular songs. And with his cousins, who I'll mention a bit later, they were the most popular dance orchestras at the time. So they would play in these amazing settings. And one of them was a cafe called the Adria, which was in Warsaw, central Warsaw. And the building still exists today. Obviously, it's not as it was. And the Adria had this revolving dance floor that people could dance the tango on. And it had an American cafe garden. It was, this really opulent place to go. And so, yeah, Peter Spersky played there, and then he was writing all of these songs. He wrote another famous one, To Ostatnia Niedziela, or The Last Sunday, which is still very popular today, and countless others as well.
Do you know what? This cafe sounds absolutely incredible. Why do we not recreate it?
I know, this is what I want to do. Literally, if I win the lottery, that's what I'm doing.
Do you know what, Alex? You and I definitely going to Warsaw, and I'm going to dance with you on that dance floor. How would you think about that idea?
I think I'm slightly worried you're going to have 2 left feet.
I do have 2 left feet. What is the problem with that?
None whatsoever.
Anyway,
as long as people aren't judging me on your dancing standards.
That's fine. That is not a problem. I can deal with that. But listen, what actually happens to him? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so Peter Spersky has this very, very successful career in the 20s and the 30s. And then obviously when the war happens, he goes into the Soviet Union. He performs with one of his cousins. And they carry on composing. And then he travels with the Andes Army through the Middle East and ends up settling in South America, in Argentina, post-war. So he goes back to the home of tango. And then he returns to Poland later on in life. But his career, his heyday, really is only in the 20s and 30s. And, of course, everything changes post-war.
We spoke about Peter Spersky and his family. Can you tell us more about the Gold brothers and their fate?
So the Gold brothers were Peter Spersky's 2 famous cousins. So they were called Henrik and Arthur Gold. And they were also making this popular music. A lot of these tangos were their compositions. And they basically saw this foothold. Their foothold was using the kind of romantic motifs, but also their kind of klezmer, Jewish backgrounds, the classical training that they had, and making these really, heartbreaking, gloomy tangos. So that was their niche. And Peter Spersky and the Gold Brothers, they would play in their little orchestra. They were the ones who would play in the Adria. They were so popular that they even had songs written about them, because they were these songs that were written about how when they would play, you won't sleep until the break of day, that kind of thing. So they were immensely popular musicians. And basically the Gold Brothers, Henrik Gold was a little bit luckier, as in he was the one who went with Peter Spersky across the Soviet Union and then survived the war. But Arthur Gold wasn't, and he was deported to Treblinka. And the story goes that he was forced to perform some of the tangos that he'd been composing dressed as a clown before he was killed. And there were so many stories like this where these talented musicians were the tragic ends that happened, and it's utterly heartbreaking.
I don't know really what to say. I wanted to make a comment there, but I just can't after hearing that, where he was dressed up just for entertainment purposes.
Yeah,
is just heartbreaking.
Yeah, it is.
But moving on to a couple of other musicians. So we have Andrzej Wajda, and what can you tell us more about him and his impact?
So he was like a powerhouse of popular culture. So his nickname was the King of Trash, because he just produced song after song after song. He was a lyricist, so he was the one writing these beautiful songs, writing the lyrics to them. And he would work with Peter Spersky, with the Gold Brothers, with other musicians. But he quickly realised that to make a hit, a kind of popular song that everyone would be listening to, it didn't really matter what the lyrics said. What mattered was the music. So he would just write like the most banal, sentimental songs, but they would become really, really popular because they were just what people wanted to hear. People wanted that popular culture. So yeah, he was producing thousands of songs. He was he was almost like a businessman, really, because he had his own publishing house. He was also directed one of the cabarets in Warsaw, and just writing these beautiful songs. I mean, it's kind of like schmaltzy sort of songs, but really, really fantastic hits. And yeah, he was one of these fantastic musicians, also a Jewish background as well. So he was certainly one of the key players at the time.
But what happened to him?
So whilst it was a similar story to Arthur Gold, so he was imprisoned in the ghetto. There are various stories about what actually happened to him. It's kind of contested, but it's either that he was trying to escape, that fellow artists were trying to smuggle him out of the ghetto and he was shot, or he was in hiding, but he was getting increasingly panicky about people, he was worried about the Germans, basically, and he ran out into the street and was shot, or he was deported. So there's no real answer to any of those questions, but he certainly also died in the war, was killed in the war.
We've got quite tragic stories here of the musicians, but I want to know, do you have anything that's positive? I want a positive story.
So there are some musicians who were able to kind of continue their careers post-war. And one of them was Mieczysław Fogg, he was like a very important crooner singer in the interwar period. He was voted like the most popular singer in 1937, I believe. And he was producing hundreds of songs a year, singing them. And he survives the war. So at the start of the war, he gets together with another cabaret artist, and they sing to all of the soldiers departing on the trains to the battlefield, basically, and they sing on the platform. And then in the Warsaw Uprising, he does about 100 performances in various places, sometimes under gunfire. And he gets sent the lyrics through the sewers, and he has like a day to learn the lyrics to a song, and then he'll perform. And he recollects later that he was given gifts of like tomatoes and stuff like that from people because they had nothing else to give him, but they were so thankful to have this music and something to give them a little bit of joy. Obviously a really, really, really tragic time. And then he's basically one of the only people who breaches that pre and post-war cultural output. So he's able to sing on and perform some of these songs, and he's kind of the reason why we still know a lot of these songs today, because so many of them, these beautiful tangos, were just completely obliterated by the war. The record companies were bombed, and a lot of the records got lost. Obviously, a lot of the artists were killed. So he's the only one who's kind of continuing this story.
So you just touched on it there. How culturally important was music to the Polish people during the war?
So it does become, really important, and particularly Fogg's work as well. He was there singing and kind of jolling people along. There are reports of people who would go to his concerts, and then they'd come out of the concerts and they'd say, I felt like we were just back in that cultural kind of heyday in the 1920s and 1930s. Obviously things in the 20s and 30s certainly weren't like a golden age at all, but culturally there was this very mature output and beautiful songs coming out of that period. So they would think that like the war was, it was almost like they'd go to his concert and the war just wouldn't exist anymore. It would just be, that they would just be swept up in this music. So yeah, music does take on this very, very important role, I think, as well, particularly in the Warsaw Uprising.
Were any of these artists that you've been talking about, did they transcend national fame? Were they popular outside Poland?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this Tango Milonga, which is 1929, that's the one that kind of really has an impact internationally. So it's sung in America, it's sung across Eastern Europe, and there were many others as well that ended up being performed all across the world. Jerzy Spersky, he was a favourite of some Russian singers at the time. And then when Spersky, when post-war, he kind of writes different songs. He writes some songs in Russian, I believe. There's one called the Handkerchief, or Blue Handkerchief, I think it's called, which is very, very popular as well. So these were really, really popular artists, very talented artists. And they, if the war hadn't happened, they quite possibly would have gone on to have an impact on the global stage even more so than they did. And one of Poland's first actually recording company, which was called Syrena Electro, and this company was selling discs, selling records all across the world. And then in 1939, they just signed a contract with HMV, or His Master's Voice, to sell in England and America. They were opening an agency in New York, but they never managed to open it because when the war happened, they were bombed and destroyed. So it's tragic in that this music wasn't allowed to have that life that it could have done.
It's definitely something that's been culturally cut short, isn't it?
For me, this music could have gone on. I think it could have gone on to have a fantastic impact on the national stage, international stage.
So we've spoken about the Second World War and the impact it's had, but how does it survive post-war?
So Fogg is one of the main players in this. I've spoken about his massive impact, cultural impact. But after the end of the Second World War, he establishes a cafe that he calls Cafe Fogg, literally in the ruins of Warsaw. And even though they haven't got any electricity, he's still performing these songs. He says he wants to give joy to residents returning to the city. Obviously, a very, very heartbreaking time for everybody. And he also establishes his own recording company called Fogg Records. And it's quite funny because Fogg was an avid car driver. He loved cars. So if you look at the logo for Fogg Records, it's the same font as the logo for the Ford cars, which were his favourite brand of car. So he sets up this recording company, and it's in his bedroom in his house. And he's got, like, from floor to ceiling, he's got this woolen cladding to stop the kind of feedback, and he is trying to issue as many records as he can. Some of them are these pre-war tangos, some of them are more modern or at the time contemporary hits, but then that's closed down by the Soviets as well. So while he helps to promote this genre, and while these tangos do survive to a certain extent, it's never the same as it was before the war.
Is there still a culture of the tango in Poland today?
So it's not to the same extent as it was. So tango was very, very kind of all-pervasive in the 20s and the 30s. It was everywhere. Whereas now, I mean, yes, there are people like dancing milongas and that kind of thing, but it's never going to be the same as it was. But But it is still being kept alive today, and there are still quite a few bands that are playing, on the streets of Warsaw and in theatres that are playing this music and trying to revive it. And I think that's amazing that, it's nearly 100 years since, it's 100 years since tango first came to Poland, and nearly 100 years since obviously its heyday, but it's still being revived today. And that's really important, I think, to remember the artists behind this music as well, because that kind of keeps them alive in a way.
Can you dance it?
No, I can't dance it. I can talk about it. I can't dance it. I'm like, this is the thing, because I'm not musical at all. I have grade 1 piano. That's it. That's the extent of my musical ability. So, and it's funny because people think I'm like, I must be, I don't know, a violin player or whatever, but I'm not. I just love this music for that gift, that emotional gift that it gives. And it kind of, the more I find of these songs, and they're just everywhere, you can find them online on YouTube and stuff like that, the more I find, the more I just fall in love with this. It's just such a beautiful, beautiful sound.
You say that, and it's true. I mean, my best friend in the world, he became a roadie and a transport driver in the music industry because he has no coordination and can't sing. So it's not something to laugh at. If you can find a way to live your passion, I say you have to do it. Yeah,
absolutely. And I mean, this is definitely my little niche, and I collect these records as well, these Prewar Records, which are immensely, but they're very brittle. So I've got one in my collection that's broken already, which I feel terrible about, but they feel like treasures in a way, because so many of them were destroyed and you have to keep them safe. And actually, about the one that's broken, I have managed to fix it. I have managed to glue it back together, and it still works. So I'm not I can be trusted with these records.
I want to know, where can we go and listen to this in Warsaw? Because I'm for sure when you come back, I'm going to come up there and we're going to go and have a dance and a listen and basically a bit of a boogie.
Let's absolutely do that. So there are loads of street bands that play this. They play the kind of street songs, the sort of really dark, murky songs that were written in the 20s and 30s. There are street bands playing for free in the Old Town in Warsaw. You can find them on every corner pretty much sometimes. But then also in theatres. So when it's the Jewish festival in Warsaw, there are various shows going on all over Warsaw with this music. But yeah, I mean, certainly it's still alive, or it's being revived. But also, any time you can just look on YouTube and find them, and they're still there, these beautiful songs. So yeah, it's still there. It's still alive in a way, which is great.
I know what I'm going to be doing when we finish this. I'm going to go and listen to some tango. But Juliette, seriously, thank you so much for this. It was so interesting, and we got to learn so much, not just about the tango, but about the people who created it, who wrote the songs, who sang the songs, who basically made it for Poland. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I've really loved talking about this as ever. So no, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Amazing. So ladies and gentlemen, next week we have the William Fletcher, who's coming to join us on pole position to talk about poles in the Napoleonic period, all because my dad asked Zach White a question he couldn't answer about the Napoleon period. So I thought we might as well learn something new. So thank you so much, and remember, people, stay safe, and importantly, if you can, stay at home. This is Nighthawk signing off.